as I said to my students this morning in the first year, I said, today on the Yortzeit, the first Yortzeit of Rabbi Sacks, all around the world, people are learning his Torah and talking about him. And I would say that probably many of the type of memorials that are happening are really teaching his Torah, and you'll hear many rabbis giving shiurim about his Torah and adding ideas to his Torah. And I think that you have an opportunity today, besides learning about Rabbi Sacks' Torah, also hearing a little bit about Rabbi Sacks, the person, and really who he was. Not learning his ideas necessarily right now, but really to try to understand who this special person was. And there are not many people, I believe, that can really give you this insight about him as well as my mother-in-law can. And it's a great opportunity, and we were very thankful that my in-laws came today. My father-in-law is in the back, Henry. And thank you very much for coming today.
Thank you very much, Rabbi. I begin by saying you'll have to excuse my voice. It is what it is right now, and I hope it won't fail me. Good morning, and it's good to be here. It's good to be here because this is part of my process of Avelut on the first yahrzeit of Rabbi Sacks. I knew him for well over 35 years. Firstly, as a parent, because I was a teacher in a school that his children attended, and I taught each one of his children. And then I knew him as a teacher when I studied Jewish ethics with him in a master class that he gave. When I was studying later on, I was 40, I started a new career. Don't believe, guys, that when you start your first career, that's your career. Life is all about moving on and changing direction. And I can tell you that because I'm a living embodiment of it. So the second time I had real interaction with him was when he taught Jewish ethics, and I was in his class. He was then the principal of what was then called Jews College, today known as the London School of Jewish Studies. And during that time I was there, he began probably the first conversation with the Jewish community. And what he did was he organized a day of learning and talking, and it was called Traditional Alternatives. And he brought to London great rabbonim and teachers from all over the world, that we spent the whole day listening to these great people. I was involved in preparing to organize that event, and after that event, or at the end of that event, as usual, there was time for questions, and I put up my hand, and he took my question. Rabbi Sacks, we have sitting in front of us a whole row of distinguished gentlemen who've been teaching us today. Why isn't there one woman sitting on this row? The following morning, I got a message to say he wanted to speak to me. And I thought, oh boy, he's going to tell me off for asking that question, because it kind of, in inverted commas, shamed him that he hadn't thought that there should be women also teaching. And I went in and I began, I'm so sorry. And he said, sorry for what? And I said, I shouldn't have really asked that question. Oh, it was great that you did. And guess what? You're going to organize the conference for next year. And it's going to be a conference by women, for women. just what we should have. And that was the kind of person he was, in the sense that he felt empowered to empower people. He believed in the power of ideas, and he believed in the importance of having the conversation. And so today, his first yard site is dedicated to this idea of communities in conversation. We, right now, are part of over 150 communities, schools, institutions all around the world that are marking this day of his yard site, and it's called Communities in Conversation. So, I'm going to begin by asking Michael to show you something, not quite yet. I want to explain to you the background of what you're going to hear. In England, on the BBC radio, every Sunday there was a program, and still is, called Desert Island Discs, where interesting people would be interviewed to understand what their choice of music was all about. And at the end of the half-hour program, what would happen was the presenter, in this case Sue Lawley, would ask 3 questions. A, what was your favorite piece out of the 8 pieces we have played? 2, you're allowed a special book to take with you on your desert island. What is it? And 3, what luxury would you like to have with you? I want you to listen carefully to what Rabbi Sacks is saying in 1991, before September the 1st, before he became Chief Rabbi. And I want you to keep it in your mind, and also to look at the pictures that they are showing at the same time. So please, Uncle, I'm standing just waiting for some.
Just open volume. You can do the same.
I wonder which one of those 8 records you would choose as being most essential to you in your isolation on the desert island.
Tamalocho nafshi, my soul thirsts for you. Quite simply, I hope one day something like that would be my epitaph, that his soul thirsted for God.
And your book. We supply the complete works of Shakespeare and the Bible.
Well, many books have influenced my life, but the book I would choose without a shadow of doubt to take on a desert island is the Talmud, the greatest of all works of rabbinic literature, a work which has kept the greatest Jewish minds occupied for the last 1500 years.
And a luxury, perhaps you'd have a bottle of vodka to drink with your record.
No, I would choose, if I could, an extremely large supply of pencils. And I could then do what it's always been my ambition to do, to write a commentary in the margins of the Talmud, that I should have added my own commentary to the Jewish heritage.
Dr. Jonathan Sacks, Chief Rabbi-elect, thank you very much indeed for letting us hear your Desert Island Discs.
Sue, many thanks.
Okay, so we're going to keep that in mind. As you know, from the age of 40, Rabbi Sacks wrote a book every year of his life, 30 books. The last book, which I forgot to bring, is called Morality, that he wrote. And after his passing, the manuscript was found for this book, which came out just before Rosh Hashanah, which is the weekly Parsha and looking at studies in spirituality. He was obsessive about his writing. He thought it was the most important way, in the early days certainly, and later through the technology of the internet, to communicate with people. When Rabbi Sacks prepared for writing a book, and by the way, the same happened to a lesser extent of when he prepared a sermon, or he was writing an article for the newspaper, or he was speaking on the radio, he would order the most amazing number of books into the office so that he could read all about the subject that he was intending to write about. He was always looking at Amazon to see what new books were around and whether they might speak to him. And as a result, his office, or his study upstairs from his house, was totally lined with books. But what was so amazing about the fact that all those thousands of books were sitting there, if we were sitting there talking about or discussing something particular, he'd jump up from his desk and he'd say, I know, there's a quote in so-and-so book, and he'd rush over and he would take that book out, and without even looking at the index, he would open it to a certain page where you would see his pencil marks, and he would quote what it was that he wanted to include in his writing. He worked so hard, he slept very little. And my connection with him in terms of Chief Rabbi happened like this. He became Chief Rabbi in 1991, and I at that time was working for the former Chief Rabbi in his capacity of an educational consultant. We were building a school called Emmanuel College. How many people are here from Britain? Right, so you know Emmanuel College. And there was this handover to Rabbi Sacks, and I truly thought that was the end of my job, until I got a call from Rabbi Sacks, and he said, I've decided that we will start a great big project called Jewish Continuity, and I want you to be part of a team of 3 to help write what this project is all about and bring it into action. Okay, that's what I did for about 9 months. And then the project was launched, and I thought, that's the end of that part. But he phoned me again, and he said, Now that we've got it on the road, I want you to be in charge of all the programs. And that's what I did until 1996. For various reasons, the project was shifted from being under the aegis of Rabbi Sacks to an organization called the UJIA, which up to now had been focused on raising children. He got people in the community to understand that it was really important to think anew, to create new projects within their communities, and to become a thriving community within the greater community. And so, it kind of didn't work because it was a project that included everyone. It was inclusive. The Orthodox rabbis didn't like the idea that the Reform and Masorti had opportunities to receive money to do various projects, and the Reform and the Masorti communities felt that they were only given a small share of the money, and that wasn't fair. Well, proportionately, that was how it worked. So, Jewish continuity as it was closed down, and I decided that I didn't want to move on with them, and I started looking at different opportunities that might come my way to begin a different job. I got a call one morning from a gentleman called Michael Sinclair, who was the chairman of Jewish Continuity, who asked me to come and see him. And he told me that Rabbi Sacks would like to see me. I went there a few weeks later, and he offered me the job of being director of his office. Now, that was mind-blowing. Never in the history of the office of the chief rabbi had a woman held that position. And I said it to him, because I knew him pretty well by then. I said, this is a crazy idea. Your rabbis will be furious. Your lay leaders will think you're crazy. And I'm not going to feel very comfortable. He said, I'll tell you what, we'll try it for 6 months and see what happens. I was there for 10, 11, 13 years. 13 years, working almost 24/7 with Rabbi Sacks. What a privilege. What an amazing opportunity. And not only was I running the office, I was working so closely with him. Everything he wrote, anything that he wanted to say, he would pass by me. And I always heard him say, after he showed it to me or read it to me, what do you think? Now that was a huge privilege, that a man of such great intellect wanted to know, what did I think? What did I think? In the beginning, I was too timid to say anything. And he'd say, come on, Syma, of course you've got something to say. You're older than me. You've got more experience than me. And I would smile. And then I did build up the courage to say what I wanted to say. And whenever I felt that something had to be changed or tweaked, within 2 minutes, it was done. And I thought that was quite unbelievable. Rabbi Sacks loved to talk with people. He wasn't a great social man. He wasn't the kind of person you'd invite to your dinner table and think that he would be chatting to each one of your guests. No, He wasn't the kind of man you'd invite to tea because you thought it was nice that he would sit around the table with you. He was focused on one-to-ones, talking to people, listening to what they were saying, and often acting upon what he heard them say. He was the great, what can I say, the great listener who introduced all of us to the art of listening. If you have his Siddur, which is the Koran Matzah with the translation, we always used to think that Shema Yisrael was Hero Israel. He changed it to listen because he felt that sometimes when you hear something, it goes in one ear and out the other. But if you actively listen to what is being said, you retain it in your mind. And I think that was a key lesson that he taught all of us. In his book, Future Tense, and how many of you have ever read anything that he's written? Anybody? Right. What have you read? Future Tense. What have you read?
Letter in the Scroll.
Letter in the Scroll. You must be American.
No.
You're English?
South African.
South African. Okay. Who else said it? What have you read at the back? Letter in the Scroll. And you?
Morality.
Morality. Oh, that's a tough one, morality. In his book, Future Tense, he wrote, Judaism is the ongoing conversation of the Jewish people with itself, with heaven, in Hashem, and the world. For Rabbi Sacks, conversation with the others is a central part of his learning process. And we need to remember that when we come in contact with the other, we listen to what they say. Even if it's not exactly what we would think, it's important to always hear from the other. And through his active listening, he became one of the world's greatest educators. Rabbi Sacks was the most unbelievable boss in the way that he included not just me as the director of the office, but the whole staff. And don't think there was a great big office. There were only 7 of us all together. But he'd always, when he came in the morning, come in, stop at each person's desk, how are you, ask a personal question, and that's how the day would begin. And then at a certain time in the morning, and it wasn't every morning, because sometimes things happened and we lost that time, he would bring us all together in his office with a cup of coffee, and there was always cake on the table. And he would give us a little Devar Torah. At the end of it, he would ask each person, what did they think? He wanted to hear. And it was interesting for me, when new people came into the office, and it was their first experience of this, the answer was always the same. Me? Why me? They were bowled over by the fact that he wanted to know from somebody in the office what they thought. He worked so hard, and we, in turn, worked very hard for him. We wanted to make sure that everything he needed, he had. He was particular about the paper that he wrote on. He was particular about the pen that he used. He was particular about the pencils that he had. Because in every book in that library of his, I can assure you, there were little comments written on the side in pencil. And I have to tell you two stories. One is about the pencil. One day, he lost his pencil, and he couldn't find where he kept his little stack of pencils, and he was in quite a state. That afternoon, when I left the office, I went to a shop, and I asked them if they had a propelling pencil. Anybody remember what a propelling pencil was? You put the lead inside, right? So you were only using the leads. And I found a beautiful, small silver pencil holder, and boxes of exactly the right number of lead that he liked to use. He was thrilled. A couple of years later, he phoned me one Sunday evening, totally distraught. He had been to a community in the afternoon to speak, as that happened very often, where communities invited him to speak, and it was in London. And when he came home and he wanted to do some work, he discovered he'd lost his pencil. And he said to me, "You have to phone the shul, and you have to ask them to search high and low for this pencil. Maybe cleaners came into the shul after we left. They need to speak to the cleaners. They need to look everywhere for that pencil, because I cannot be without the pencil." So I phoned the shul, I explained the situation. They phoned me back, they said they couldn't find the pencil. And of course, the next day, in the post, arrived a beautiful pencil from the shul to replace the one that he'd lost. And he said, "Isn't this beautiful? But it's not the same pencil." Anyway, a year later, he phones me up and he says, "Guess what? I was going to put on a suit that I hadn't worn for almost a year, and I put my hand in the suit pocket, in the breast pocket, and guess what I found? Your pencil." So that's how particular he was about pencils. I said I was going to tell you another story, and it's actually gone straight out of my mind, so I'll leave that. So, as I said, he was an amazing boss. He was creative, he was incredibly hardworking, and he was always prepared. What did he teach me? He taught me so much about all sorts of things. In the middle of an evening, he'd phone and say, "Are you busy?" And I'd say no. He'd say, "Listen to this," and he'd play me a piece of music. Or the following morning, nice and early, he would call me and say, "Last night, I couldn't write anymore and I couldn't sleep. So I turned on the television and I found this film called so and so and so." And he would tell me why the film was so important to him. His favorite film, by the way, was The Shawshank Redemption. But later on, I think that Hamilton played an important role in his thinking. So he had this tremendous trust in me, always encouraging me to go one step further. When he asked me to do something which I thought was something I really couldn't cope with, or I wouldn't be able to manage, or it was above me, he would always encourage me and say, "Come on, you can do it. I know you can do it." And just on the sideline, that was how he dealt with things in the community. Rabbi Sacks never wrote a letter of endorsement for a school, a yeshiva, an organization. People wanted his support. He would say, you do it, and I'm supporting you. And he would always arrange for a reception in his home so that people who would be supporters would hear him speak, encouraging this organization, that school, that yeshiva, whatever it was, on their way. And that's how he was with his staff. Whenever he had an idea, and that was an idea amongst so many, he wanted to tease it out. He never believed that his idea was sacred. He would have a list of people that he would ask me to share the idea with, to hear their opinions before he actually committed himself to that idea. His patience in waiting for people to answer was quite amazing. Oh, I know what the story is that I wanted to tell you. So I told you he read a lot of books, and a lot of books used to come into the office. Various publishing houses wanted to feel that it was important that Rabbi Sacks had read their new book, so they would send it in. One day, I used to open the post every morning. One day a book arrived. I can't remember what it was about. I looked through it because I always used to say to him, this book has come from this publisher and it's about. So I had to know what it was about. And I thought to myself, this looks so interesting. So when I gave it to him, I said, Chief Rabbi, when you're finished reading that book, would you mind lending it to me? I thought it was very interesting. Sure, he said. That afternoon at 5:30, I had to be at his home because there was going to be a reception at 6 o'clock. He walked down the staircase and I was standing at the bottom and he had the book in his hand. I said, how's the book going? He said, very interesting. Here we are. I said, no. I said I wanted to read it when you'd finished it. I finished it, he said. Now, you look at page so-and-so and you'll find this line to be extremely important. Or look on page so-and-so, I've made some notes in pencil for you to think about. That was what he was like. He read a book a day, and maybe even 2 books a day. And what was so amazing was he remembered them. He knew exactly what they were about, and as I told you earlier on, he would just go to that book in his library because he knew that book held an important piece of information that was useful to him. Amazing. When we went on long journeys and I sat in the car with him, he would bring a whole pile of books with him, and I would watch him going through these books with a piece of paper, making notes for whatever it is that he was going to write about or talk about. I just wanted to bring to your attention this very new book that came out last week. This book, The Power of Ideas, if you really want to understand who this man was and what he meant to the world, this is filled with broadcasts, speeches in the House of Lords and elsewhere that he made. And it's really worth getting. I got mine through the book depository, and it was much cheaper than the price that they were selling it for. Really a fantastic book. When we used to go early in the morning to the BBC, because he regularly broadcast in a program called Today, which started at 6 in the morning or 6:30 and finished at exactly 9 o'clock. At 10 minutes to 8, for some peculiar reason, a person spoke, usually someone from the church or from a mosque or someone who had some connection with a religious organization. And Rabbi Sacks regularly spoke on it. It was called Thought for the Day. It was interesting going with him. First of all, he had to send in by 6 o'clock the previous evening the text of what he was going to say, just in case there was something that the BBC didn't fancy having broadcast over their radio waves. Never once, certainly in the 13 years I worked with him, did they ever send the transcript back. When we walked into the office, and on the journey there, he'd be talking to me about what do you think so-and-so would say when they heard this, and do you think so-and-so would appreciate a copy of it? And we would discuss it. When we got to the BBC and we were ushered into what was a waiting room before you actually went and did your broadcast, so many, it was very open. So it was open but separated by glass. So all the people working in this section of the BBC would see that Rabbi Sacks had arrived. And slowly, one by one, they'd get up from their desks to come and shake his hand and to talk to him. On one occasion, when he spoke about anti-Semitism, I remember at the end of it, because everybody could hear it, all the staff in that part of the office got up and cheered. It was an amazing moment. So, what am I saying? Rabbi Sacks didn't just teach his Torah to us, the Jewish people. He taught his Torah with the same passion that he taught us to the non-Jewish world. And guess what? They got it. They understood it. Because he used the Torah to teach people about life, how to value life, how to live life. And people found that very important. And he had these huge number of people that listened to Thought for the Day. What was interesting were the letters that came in afterwards. They weren't from prominent people. They were from Jewish people who had gone to live somewhere in the country to escape the fact that they were Jews. Jewish people who might have been prominent in society, but people never knew they were Jewish, would write and say, I loved your thought for the day. It spoke to me. I am Jewish, and I had forgotten my roots, and you awoke in me a thirst to learn more. So in a funny way, these broadcasts and speeches that were made to the wider public, I used to call them Rabbi Sacks's Kiruv work, because he brought in so many people from the outside. I think we're coming to the end, and of course I could speak to you forever, but what I did want to say to you was, you are here in Yeshiva. Many of you may have come from a home where Rabbi Sacks was with you at your Shabbat table, his covenant and conversation. You heard of covenant and conversation? My husband is a hoarder, and it wasn't a problem when I asked him this morning, do you have a copy of the first Covenant and Conversation series? This is how they came out. They were sent to people who were interested. We started with 20. In the end, I think there are millions of people who read every week his Covenant and Conversation. If you get tidbits, it's in tidbits. It's translated into so many languages. It's quite, how can I say, awe-inspiring. And this, I wanted to connect to what he said to Suluri. He wanted a pencil to be able to write his commentary on the Talmud because he wanted his Torah to be part of the story of the Jewish people. And I think he very much achieved that. This week, Sedra Chayesara, he has something very interesting to say. He talks about the sad situation that Abraham found himself in. He'd just come from Akedat Yitzchak, and he heard that his beloved wife, who had been his partner, who had been his teammate, his soulmate, had passed away. And what did he do? He looked for somewhere to bury her. And we all know that story about how important it was for him to buy from Ephron that piece of land, Machpelah. He also was concerned about his son. He was 37 years old and he wasn't married. So he sent out his servant to go and look for a wife for his son. What do we learn from Rabbi Sacks about this Sedra? We learn that when things are sad, there are traumatic times, tragic times, we have to do the mourning, but think about what do we do for the future. He bought the piece of land and he made sure that through his son's marriage there would be a continuity of the Jewish people. Rabbi Sacks, as I told you before, took a personal interest in every one of our lives, all the people that worked for him. He came to Israel especially when Rav Aviad and Deborah were married. He was there and he spoke at their wedding. When our son got married, he was Masat Kedushi. Sadly, our son became terminally ill. Every week, Rabbi Sacks would make sure that he telephoned our son, who lived in Israel, to see how he was doing and to give him his. And there were times when he felt very down, and I would call up Rabbi Sacks and say, please pick up the phone and speak to him. And after that conversation, my son, who had probably been lying in bed and feeling really that he couldn't continue much more, sat up, got out of bed and said, there are things to do, we have to carry on. That was the message he learned. And sadly, when he passed away, he flew in to deliver a hesped at his kever. So he took great interest in our lives. He wanted to know how we were doing. There wasn't a day when he would not ask me, how is Henry, my husband? There wasn't a day when he wouldn't ask if everybody in the family were fine. He was special. And I hope that in my telling you how special he was, when you guys become whatever you become, and there are people around you working with you, you will take that interest not just treat them as somebody who's doing a job, but somebody who is there with you and working with you and whose life is important. We have 5 minutes for questions, and then, Michael, 2 things to put up again. Any questions? Yes.
You said that he'd read a book a day. Did he ever read any fiction books or anything that wasn't some type of, I don't know, educational literature? Or...
He read fiction books, but very seldom. He read the kind of fiction books that gave him an idea about the value of life. Do you understand? So, you know, I told you his favorite book was the film was Shawshank Redemption, but he'd read the book before, and that was fiction, but he felt it taught him or helped him to think about a particular value in life. He had, by the way, the most wonderful sense of humor, and if you ever listen to any of his speeches on the internet, you will find that more often than not, he had a little joke to tell. He loved telling jokes, that was for sure. Any other questions? So, I told you a little bit about Rabbi Sacks. My real hope is that I've interested you a little bit more about this great teacher that we were privileged to have in our lives, and that you will pick up some of his teachings and learn from them, and not learn from them just for yourselves, but learn from them, and what you've learned, share with others. Many of you will be going on to campuses where things are tough for Jewish students. Read what he has to say about anti-Semitism. Read about what he has to say about the importance of the other and listening to the other. And make sure that you, like him, become an ambassador for the Jewish people. Thank you for listening. You